This meeting is being recorded.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Welcome, Malaji. Welcome, Dr. Melissa.
Thank you.
We'll start the session with a very small invocation. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. We welcome you all to Reimagining Indigenous Education online series. This is the Maori edition. I now pass the dais on to Srimati Matrushi Smriti ji to start with the introduction address.
Good morning, good evening, and namaste, everyone. Just a minute. So welcome to this online series on Indigenous education by the newly started Center for Indigenous Knowledge Systems at Anaadi Foundation. And just to introduce Anaadi Foundation, we started Anaadi Foundation in 2015. My husband and I. Before that, we were professors of computer science at a university. And then we observed that many students came to us not with computer science problems, but with life problems. So we wanted to start this foundation in order to help the youth lead an inspired, fulfilling, and sustainable life that is of value to the society and the planet, of course. So we have an ashram near Palani in Tamil Nadu. And we also have a Gurukulam, which is an Indian way of learning. We offer, the subject matters include Ayurveda, yoga, Indian astronomy, mathematics, completely indigenously developed, right from the ancient times, whatever has been handed over by the rishis of the tradition, we offer it here together with the open schooling system so that the students also have touch with the whatever is happening in the mainstream education, but at the same time live in an immersive environment to learn whatever is offered through the Indic way of life. And the Center for Indigenous Knowledge Systems we started because the Gurukulam education is not just relevant in India, not just available in India, but globally there is an awakening towards reinvigorating the indigenous knowledge systems. In fact, we had the chance, my husband and I had the chance to speak at University of California, Berkeley on reimagining indigenous education, and it was hosted by a group called Sunflower Sutras. And we had a lot of people from the indigenous or native cultures come and present their thoughts and ideas, and we also had an opportunity to present about Indian education system. And what we observed is that many of these educational processes sort of have been pushed to the museums without being an active availability. And many parents who belong to these indigenous or native cultures have started positively worrying about the next generation because they see that the current educational process is becoming very, in a way, unidimensional, competition based, not encouraging so much of cooperation, very, very cut off from nature, where even children do not know where do they get their food from. If you ask a child, probably I get milk from the supermarket. They have no access to where the source of food is or what happens to the food or the products after we use them. So many of these things are still a black box to the young generation. And we do see that looking at the crisis that is happening, healthcare wise, education wise, economic system, ecology wise, there is an excellent scope for Indigenous knowledge systems to contribute in these areas. Even during the COVID, many of the people in India observed that, not just the modern medicine system, but the Indigenous medicine seems to be working much better for them. So there was a huge movement towards yogic practices, towards Ayurveda, and many of these systems in India and many other countries. So that way, we are, we're very happy and fortunate to be working with various people in different countries to see whatever seva we can offer to the Indigenous knowledge process from whatever little background and expertise we have developed in this process, and also learn from all these groups. That way, we are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Melissa with us today. She is from New Zealand, and Varalakshmi will shortly introduce both the speakers. We have Dr. Mala Kapadia, who has tremendous amount of experience in Indigenous knowledge systems, and we really look forward to having both of them on this forum.
Thank you, Matushi. Let me just take this opportunity to very quickly introduce both our guest speakers. I'm just sharing my screen. I hope my screen is visible.
Yeah, it is.
So we have with us Dr. Melissa. She is a senior lecturer at University of Waikato, specializing in early literacy and human development. Her core research focuses on the impact of Whānau and localized curriculum on foundational literacy skills. It has keen interest in the Maori education. We were quite thrilled to learn about the braided reverse approach, especially impacting the foundational literacy and numeracy. So we look forward to hearing more from you in today's session, Dr. Melissa.
Thank you.
We have with us our very own Dr. Malaji. She's the director of Anaadi Transdisciplinary Research Initiatives at our foundation. She is also the founder of Human Potential Consulting named Tame the Monkey. She has worked previously as the director of Center for Wellbeing and Wellness and as a professor at the Rishihood University. She's a very multi-talented, multifaceted lady. She has a PhD in literature. She has diverse academic background in psychology, human resources, yoga, Ayurveda, filming, and video production as well. A warm welcome to you, Malaji. May I now request Dr. Melissa to please enlighten us with her research in the Maori education.
Thank you so much. Is it possible for me to share my screen? It's okay?
Absolutely. Just a moment. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Let me just...
I've enabled screen sharing.
Is that okay? People can see? It's okay?
Yes.
Okay. So firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to share with you this afternoon. In New Zealand, it's the afternoon, early evening, but the morning, perhaps for many of you. It's a real privilege to connect with you, and I hope this is the beginning of something wonderful together in learning and sharing with one another Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous practices, and how they can make a difference for our children, our communities, our adults, obviously, and of course our world. Please excuse me, I'm not well at the moment, so I'm trying not to cough too much. If I do, please bear with me. When I got the invitation, I thought, wow, what should I talk about? Because there's so much that we can share with one another in this space. But what I wanted to share with you today is a research framework called He Awa Whiria, which in the Maori language means a braided river. So rivers where lots of different strands come together to form the one river. I'll talk a little bit this afternoon about how, there we go, what this braided river has looked like in practice, so where it came from, but also where what it looks like in reality. So it's one thing to talk about a theory, but how can we make that connection between theory and practice, and what difference can it make for our communities? So I'll talk about the framework where it emerged from, but also what it looks like in practice, using a research case study that I was involved with a few years ago, and also some of the key findings and learnings from that particular piece of research, and looking forward to the future, He Awa Whiria, a braided rivers approach in the future. So please, if anything's unclear, feel free to interrupt me or stop me. I need to get used to using not Maori words in my presentation. So whānau, I saw it on the introduction, is family. So I work a lot with families. So some years ago, my PhD supervisor, whom I work very closely with, and he's had a lot of involvement in Māori education in New Zealand, mostly in the area of behavioural practices. He was in a meeting in Wellington, which is our capital city, and he was with a group of scientists looking at behavioural approaches for children, and he came away very frustrated, and it's probably an experience we can all relate to, because he was trying to put forward his view from an Indigenous perspective, but he was the only voice at the table. He found himself very frustrated, not heard. There was little regard, if any, given to his perspective and the Indigenous approaches. So when he flew back to Christchurch, which is in the South Island of New Zealand, he looked out of the plane window, and you can see this part of the country has many braided rivers. So he got the inspiration from that for a research framework where the idea is that we can draw from both sources of knowledge in order to create solutions that are more powerful than one or other may bring about on its own. So there is a lot of rich knowledge, particularly in the area I work with young children's early literacy development, that's emerged from the Western science side of scholarship. But there's a lot that we can draw from in an Indigenous sense that will contribute to enhancing outcomes for our children. So the idea of this model is that we have different factors or aspects or pieces of knowledge or approaches or theories, findings in each of those baskets on either side of this model, and then we weave them together in order to create something at the bottom, whether it's an intervention, an approach, policy, practice, whatever space you might be working in order to enhance outcomes in a truly partnership approach. I should add that in New Zealand, we have a treaty of Waitangi, it's called, which is the founding document of this country, which was signed in 1840, an agreement between the British Crown and Indigenous Māori people in this country that is the idea of partnership. So this model gives life to that treaty relationship. So what it looks like in practice, 10 years ago, the New Zealand government, nearly 10 years ago now, the New Zealand government wanted to solve some of the big problems in this country, and they funded hundreds of millions of dollars into national science challenges. One that I was a part of was a challenge focused solely on children and children's development. And one of the key in the early years, very early years, so that we can set children up as best as we possibly can for them to flourish throughout their life. This particular challenge identified literacy and early learning as crucial to children's outcomes. And there was a real commitment to raising literacy levels in New Zealand, which have been on the decline for a long time now, and very significantly in the last couple of years. One of the statistics I read when I joined this big research project in 2016 was that 1 in 3 children in New Zealand doesn't meet the required standard for reading in the first year of primary school. This is aged 5 or 6 years old. And 1 in 4 does not meet the required standard for writing. And always in New Zealand, we hear Indigenous Māori children are overrepresented in the cohort of children who don't have the best educational outcomes. But that kind of thinking makes me annoyed because it's suggesting that the reason for Māori children, some Māori children, to be experiencing these outcomes is because they are Maori, and it suggests that there is some sort of deficit or disadvantage in being Maori, which of course that isn't true. So I don't like that sort of framing, but from our government, we hear it all the time, and it may be the same for you in your home countries. What I wanted to know as well, and I see this a lot, is a lot of models, educational models and frameworks and programs are imported into New Zealand, sometimes from America, often from Scandinavian countries. And they think this worked in Finland, it will work in New Zealand. But maybe it was working with English, children who spoke English only. And of course, there might be a difference for children who are exposed to different languages. So I don't like this kind of square peg, round hole, it will work because it worked elsewhere. We need to make sure we have grassroots programs that are developed in a culturally contextualized space. So I wanted to look at how literacy develops for children who are exposed to both English and the Māori language. That you can see there, Te Reo Māori in brackets, that means the Māori language, because it could be different compared with children who just hear one language. So I came across an intervention that had a lot of success with children in the preschool years, that's 0 to 5 in New Zealand, where children had better vocabulary, better ability to hear the sounds and words, better understanding of a story. And these are all really crucial skills that children need to be strong in order to feel confident, to see themselves as a learner, to feel like they belong and they can connect in learning environments. So I really liked this program. It's called Tender Shoots. But I didn't want to just go, this works here, let me place this in Māori communities and bilingual early childhood centres, because that's what I don't like happening, right? What I see with other programs from overseas. So here is where a Braided Rivers framework, here our Awhiria framework, was so valuable, because I was able to take all of the rich learning and knowledge and research findings that had emerged from programs like Tender Shoots, but also to bring in Māori pedagogy, Māori oral traditions, Māori practices to make it relevant for the people with whom I was working. So what I did was you can see the baskets there in this slide. Under the Western stream of knowledge, I had things like the sounds and words, the ability to hear those sounds and words, the vocabulary knowledge, understanding of a story, those things I mentioned before, and other things. I'm talking briefly about this, that children need to be strong in, and how can we enhance those skills for children that will really help their early learning. But on the other hand, I wanted to incorporate the way that Māori education worked in traditional times. So we used to, and still do, use oral traditions, oral narratives, stories to pass information and knowledge and teaching from generation to generation. So I wanted to bring in all of those rich histories and traditions into this program. I also wanted to look at the way that knowledge was transmitted, not only through telling stories, but also through songs, chants, storytelling, reminiscing about the past. The past in the Māori worldview is very crucial. What's happened in the past sort of guides us into our future, and our ancestors are very important. So I wanted to bring in those aspects to enhance this and make this a responsive literacy program for children who speak both English and Māori. So they're Māori children and their families. So this is my great-grandfather here with the cloak, the korowai it's called, and he was a very skilled orator. So he passed knowledge from generation to generation through storytelling, song, chants. We also have carvings and other ways. The person next to him was the first Maori ever to gain a PhD. He was my grandfather's cousin, and he got this at the University of Edinburgh. So he held firm to his Maori traditions and his culture, but also flourished in the world beyond New Zealand. So the things that I wanted to consider was Maori oral traditions, as I've mentioned, the arrival of the written word in New Zealand. Until the British arrived in New Zealand, Maori was completely oral society. So no written word, everything was with speaking, songs, or with carvings. So I also wanted to move away from the deficit thinking related to Maori education. In this country, there is a lot, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, a lot of suggestion, sometimes politely made, but still made, that there is some sort of disadvantage to being Maori, and that there is some sort of inherent or sort of expectation of failure or struggle for Maori children, which isn't true. When we look at our history, particularly when the written word arrived in this country, we embraced it enthusiastically, very quickly. We had over 42 Māori language newspapers in circulation, amazing uptake of this very crucial skill. Some people suggest that literacy for Māori is kind of like another form of colonization because the written word arrived with British. I disagree with that because of what our ancestors did when this new skill was presented to them. And of course, when you look at literacy through a human rights framework, the access literacy affords as a skill in and of itself, but also as a tool that impacts on every area of our life: health and well-being, community engagement, civic engagement, lifelong learning. It's very a crucial skill to have. So I don't agree with the scholars who suggest that we don't need to concern ourselves with Māori literacy and children's outcomes. The other things I considered, like I've mentioned, in the weaving together, the ability to hear the words, the vocabulary, the fact they spoke 2 languages, their understanding of a story, and of course the crucial role that families play in a Māori context in terms of nurturing children and being those first teachers. So very quickly, I worked in a bilingual two early childhood centres in the South Island of New Zealand. Nōku Te Ao is the name. I have permission to name them. And I centred the activities with families because that aligned with a Māori worldview of Māori as first teachers, not the early childhood centre. Most programs like this run with schools, with early childhood centres, with learning institutions, but I wanted to look at the role that family play as a source of strength and inspiration, not always problem, which is how they're often characterised in New Zealand. Really what I wanted to know was what difference did the Braided Rivers approach make in terms of the intervention that was created to all of the early learning skills that the early literacy skills that children had. I should point out that I made sure that the paraphernalia associated with the program, all of the resources, everything was in both languages. Everything, I used a lot of Māori artifacts for the children to engage with. So as much as possible, I wanted the children to connect with that aspect of their culture and their language. The findings were really positive. So every child maintained or improved their early literacy skills at a 6-month post-intervention data collection. So the intervention lasted for 14 weeks. And at the end of 14 weeks, I waited 6 months and then went back to see if the gains they had made were sustained, and they were. English was definitely the dominant language over Māori, but that's very normal when we look at the history of the Māori language in this country, and also the fact that English is very dominant in our society anyway. But the children who were very strong in English and very strong in Māori could transfer those skills between 2 languages. there was a really positive shift in the way that families talked with their children and read with their children. And they also felt a really increased awareness of the importance of literacy for their home, and that they were very happy about the difference that they had made in their children's early learning. So it was really about empowering families as well to see the difference that they could make. Excuse me. I've put there some quotes about some of the findings that the mothers who engaged with the project, that they shared with me about the skills that their children had at the end of this particular program that they did. Improved learner, more confident and engaged. All of these things have a huge impact on children's outcomes, because the more that they see themselves as a learner, the stronger their learner identity is, the more confident they feel, the more competent they're likely to become, and then it just snowballs. So our Whiwhiria made a huge difference to my project. I was able to incorporate Māori practices, Māori culture, language, and that meant a huge amount to the families who engaged with the project. When I was inviting people to participate in the research, so many people said, oh yes, I can relate to this because I see myself reflected in the research that you're doing. I haven't come in with this square peg, round hole, trying to make it fit like we do with programs from Scandinavia and so on. They said, yes, that works for us. I'm happy to join in with this because I see that you have used aspects of our knowledge and our traditions to see how they may make a difference for our children. There were some other really interesting things around the analysis. I used He Awa Whiwhiria at every point of the research design. So not only the design and conceptualization of the project, but also in analysis. When children are very young, in English, they tend to only be able to identify the number of syllables in very small words, maybe 2 words, words that have 2 syllables. But in Māori, our words are very long. My son, for example, his name is 5 syllables long, and he, at age 2, could say that very easily. So I didn't want to put assumptions from English onto children who speak a different language. So what I found was that I wanted to give Māori children the chance to identify the sounds in the syllables in words 4 syllables long, and they could all do it, no problem. So the finding from English applied, but we need to go beyond that to say, well, just because it works here, is it going to be the same here? And be prepared to see beyond what we know from some of the research from Western science, if you like. I really enjoyed using a strengths-based approach with single case design. Every child was their own measure. I didn't compare the children. I just looked at where a child started on his or her own and the gains that they made. So the child didn't feel that they were in some competition with the other children in the study. And I had an opportunity, as I mentioned, to fight back against some of the deficit narratives related to Māori children and education. Sometimes they are nicely framed by our government in a way of trying to help, but the underlying messages are still ones of inferiority or disadvantage or predicting failure or struggle rather than success. In order to He Awa Whiwhiria has had a lot of impact in the research world, both in New Zealand, particularly in New Zealand, but it's starting to have some impact overseas. It's been adapted in Aboriginal community that I have worked with in Australia, and we are starting to see some impact there, and we have invitations to share in Indigenous communities in America as well. So we wanted to capture, myself and my PhD supervisor who saw this image on the plane, wanted to capture the impact it's had in New Zealand so far, and we have a book coming out in later in 2023 that shares with everybody the different areas that this framework has been used: science, policy, research, government agencies, big national science challenges, so that people can feel that there is a way to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into their work. It provides a pathway for that to happen. So I think I'm right on time at 20 minutes. Would like to thank all of you for joining me this afternoon or this morning and for hearing a little bit about some of the work that I do. I'm more than happy to continue conversations after our session today. So thank you so very much for inviting me. I'm truly humbled to be here. And there's a reference list in case anybody wanted to look those up. I'll hand back to you now.
Thank you, Dr. Melissa. That was such a very useful and very relevant presentation indeed. So pragmatically, culturally contextualized education space is something we're all looking at. And there never can be a one shoe will fit all type of approach. And I feel the braided reverse is something that resonates so very well with this idea. So I would also request Ma Smritiji to sort of introduce things as to how we look at education from Anaadi Foundation side and our endeavors in making this happen, especially in a bilingual context and things like that. Because we also have a similar thing, such as whereas the mother tongue, the common tongue that we speak at our home is very different, while the language, formalized language, is that of English. And there is also this confusion of whether it is alpha syllabic or not. So we would like, I'd request Smriti ji to sort of give our Ma.
Before we hand it over to Dr. Malaji, I thought I will quickly present about some of the curriculums that we have developed with respect to the Indigenous knowledge systems. At some stage, we at Anaadi Foundation sort of took cognizance of the thought that many of the children even now continue to learn the same kind of English rhymes that we used to learn in terms of Baba Black Sheep or Jack and Jill and such things that may or may not have a culturally relevant context. So what we did was we developed an early childhood curriculum, which is in line with the India's national curricular framework and national education policy. So it's called the Satvidya Early Indic Education, and the different facets of it includes mainly positive values through stories. We have umpteen stories which are culturally relevant across the country. We have for every state, we have a language, we have numerous dialects, and we have ethnic and locally relevant stories. We bring them out. And the second aspect is Kantapata. The Indian education system, I'm sure Dr. Mala will elaborate on this, has relied on memory-based training. So when we say memory-based training, it's not just rote learning, because all of Indian knowledge system, at least most of it since ancient times, has been in the form of poetry, meter, and song. It could be related to healthcare, say Ayurveda, it could be related to yoga, it could be related to Indian math, it could be related to, say, even architecture for that matter. All of this is codified in the form of song, meter, and poetry. So that is one of the ways that they handed over this knowledge system from one generation to another. So a key focus area in the educational curriculum that we have developed is to do with Kanta Patha, which is memory-based learning. Kanta is basically this throat, so people chant those verses and learn it. Within 8 years, they can learn n number of verses. The other aspect is, of course, foundational literacy, which is to do with the mother tongue, which is the language of that particular state or where they were born in. Sanskritam, which is a very, very ancient language of the world. And of course, English, so that they can make sense of what is happening in the outside world as well. The other one is also to learn and observe patterns in nature. So nature-based education, one of the commonalities that at least I observed in all of Indigenous education is to do with nature-based education. People live in nature, learn from nature, observe patterns in nature. So a good part of it is to do with observing and learning from nature. Could be plants, could be animals. Cow is very, very sacred in India. So at the Gurukulam here as well, we have a Goshala where children take care of the cows. They live with them practically, they nurture them. They develop a very close relationship with the cows. And we also have mathematics since very, very ancient times. The contribution of Indians to the mathematics has been very significant. We've had excellent mathematicians like Aryabhatta, And many of these people contribute to global mathematics. However, of course, because of colonization and many aspects of history, we have lost these roots. People don't know where most of the mathematics came from. But we do have a lot of manuscripts in India that talk about these mathematical, contributions. So some of it, we teach it as part of this curriculum in a very, very indigenous way. The pedagogy is indigenous, the content is indigenous, and the way of living is also indigenous, but with a global perspective. The sixth dimension is to do with samskaras, which are really important habits in the Indian tradition, where simple things, developing love and respect for elders, working with, collaboration, not being jealous of the other, being honest, being dharmic, basically worrying not just about yourself, but about the society, about the environment, and the larger purpose of life as well. So we bring in all these dimensions through samskaras. Samskaras are basically to do with the doing. You have a philosophical structure in place, but how do you action it? Those are the samskaras and values and habits that you build in the children. So these dimensions we focus on. We've developed an entire curriculum up to the age of 8. Beyond the age of 8, we have developed indigenous textbooks as well, which many schools and many learners, more than 2,000 learners are currently using those textbooks. And beyond with respect to the teenage, what we've done is that it's a very crucial age where the reasoning starts developing. So we are developing, content based on values, based on, politics, governance, and also logical reasoning, which is called Nyaya Shastra and Tarka Shastra in the Indian knowledge systems. So we're developing content towards all this so that teenagers can form a worldview which is based on analytical thinking, reasoning, completely based on indigenous pedagogy and content. And the idea of the Center for Indigenous Knowledge Systems is to understand the principle of education globally. So not just restricting to the Indic curriculums, but also looking at all the traditions and exploring how the focus on indigenous spiritual practices bring values. One of the core aspects of the Indian education system is the spiritual values that we look at. So we don't look at things just as diverse things like this is a tree, this is a plant, this is me, that's an animal. We also look at the unifying principle, which is the divine principle that connects all of this, the consciousness principle. So when that is taught first, then what happens first, the unified worldview develops before we go into the differentiated worldview. And then how these education principles can solve modern day learner challenges, for that matter. People talk about attention deficit disorders, mental health issues and all that. There's so much in the pedagogy, the content and the design of the educational ecosystem as well, where indigenous knowledge systems can really help. And I'm really thankful for Dr. Melissa to have brought out some of these in her presentation. And exploring diverse pedagogies prevalent in indigenous education, presenting a practitioner's perspective, co-evolving methods, tools, and pedagogies, and harnessing indigenous systems to create transdisciplinary content. So over a period of time, by working with experts across the world, we want to be able to develop a framework that includes all these principles coming from these diverse cultures, so that this framework is available for any learner, any educator, any educational ecosystem to adopt, so that the children of the future have a happy and positive education that is not stressful, that is not just objective, but also includes these subjective components. So thank you to the speakers for being here. Over to Varalakshmi to invite the next speaker.
Thank you, Matushi. So it's with a lot of fondness that we welcome Dr. Malaji to share her insights and a life of experience with us on the stage. Malaji, over to you.
Thank you so much, Vara. Yeah, I need to share my screen for the PowerPoint.
Yes. Yes.
Malaji, you can now share.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Melissa, first of all, for a wonderful presentation. I did do a little reading on Maori education. And as Smruti beautifully pointed out, there are so many common points when we just say indigenous education, it's almost like this, one world, one language, one way of looking at the world and wanting from life, right? So Anaadi Foundation, of course, I'm a part of Anaadi, so I'm not formally thanking anyone here, but this really gave me an opportunity to put together thoughts that have been there in my mind for a long time. There is a book called The Beautiful Tree by Dharampal. And this is what Mahatma Gandhi said way back in London, right? That today India is more illiterate, and British thought that they made India civilized. Unfortunately, it's just the other way around. They uprooted our education and disconnected us from our own roots. And it's really sad that even post our independence, we are still struggling to, get that tree rerouted. Of course, as I end the presentation with a more positive note on what's happening currently in India, we'll look at the beautiful tree again. How I see the world today is that there is a 4E crisis for humanity. Somewhere thanks to the colonization, somewhere thanks to the mindset and the worldview created by industrial era, which has led to the pandemic world. Economic crisis, everyone understands, and I'm really sad to know my son lives in New Zealand. So I'm quite updated about what's happening in New Zealand, and I'm really sad to know that they have declared there is a recession, right? So world over, economic crisis gets registered immediately. Then, of course, there are a lot of mental health issues. So emotional crisis, ecological, we all know that United Nations Sustainability Development Goals are far away from getting the implementation needed. However, what is missed out is that at the root of everything is the ethical crisis. And I truly believe that all over the world, not just Indian Gurukul system, but all over the world, the indigenous education is rooted in ethics. In India, we call it dharma. In different cultures, maybe it is called differently, but it ultimately means the same thing. So Indian education, when we look at it, I would like to emphasize on 3 things in my presentation, and then we can have some question and answers. What is the purpose? It's very important to understand what is the purpose of education, because for a colonized world, the purpose of education is only to create skill needed for a job, right? So earlier they needed only 2 hands to work in a factory, and now they need only a brain to work in for software or AI development. What is, depending on the purpose, obviously the education content would be decided. And then obviously, depending on the purpose and content, there is a pedagogy, which is obviously a part of the entire education. So when we look at purpose of education, we realize that central to Indian indigenous education was character building. At the core of it is your character. And your character connects with your dharma, as Smriti rightly pointed out, where dharma is the first principle which creates sustainability. Dharma is a Sanskrit word, which actually means that whatever is sustaining the universe, whatever is sustaining the cosmos, is also sustaining us as an individual, as community, as nation, as planet and cosmos. So we are mini cosmos. And therefore, the way we live has to be aligned. And we need to understand how to get aligned with the cosmos. And if this is the purpose, then obviously it leads to development of human potential, what Abraham Maslow called self-actualization. Unfortunately, even the interpretation in the colonized world is very distorted, where Maslow has been, depicted as talking of hierarchy of needs, where self-actualization comes at the top of it. And very few people, less than 1% in the world, can reach self-actualization. However, when we look at the purpose of indigenous education in India, the pyramid is reverse. So the triangle is reversed, where the tip of the triangle, which is in reality in Maslow's original model, is not self-actualization, but self-transcendence. Right? So how do I transcend my xenophobic understanding of myself? And how do I contribute to the entire process of evolution? And this was a purpose, basic purpose of evolution was that. So obviously, what is the content of education? I'm grateful that Smriti came in between Melissa's presentation and mine, because the entire model of Anaadi education has clarified this. So when you want to learn about self, our rishis looked at the nature. You know, they never looked at libraries. They never looked at books, because as you talked about Maori education being oral tradition, even Indian indigenous process was called Smriti and Shruti. So you listen to your masters and you remember it. And how we learn from nature is because in yoga and Ayurveda, very clearly they manifest that whatever is there in the cosmos is within us. And beautifully now science and spirituality are coming together. So what Indian indigenous education talks of 5 elements or Panch Mahabhuta, right? That we all, and everything in cosmos is made up of ether, air, fire, water, earth, right? And all these 5 elements have one or more than one gunas, which is the energy. And the energy is divided into sattva, rajas, tamas. These are the Sanskrit words, but basically they mean light or, you know, luminosity. It means action, and it also means stability. And these 3 energies are interwoven to create the universe. And in our human body, we realize this combination as Pancha Kosha. Pancha is 5 in India, and Kosha are, I mean, I know it's very difficult to translate Sanskrit into English, but Kosha is energy sheets that make us, right? I mean, today quantum physics and quantum mechanics are talking of human energy field, right? And they are talking of universal energy field, where human and universe, they are a continuum of energy field. So Panchakosha is nothing else but awareness of how our bodies are a gross energy or matter, which is visible to each other. However, beyond matter are the energy sheets which continue. And therefore, the entire pedagogy is into development of Panchakosha, is into development of our own energy field to become higher energy rather than get pulled down by lower animal nature. And this creates the worldview. How do I view the world? Because when I know that I'm the cosmos, then I don't feel inferior to anyone. I don't feel superior to anyone. I don't feel the need to compete with anyone. But I realize that I just have to collaborate with everyone. I just have to be in harmony and alignment. And this becomes the meta-knowledge and cognition, which guides our entire teaching and learning process. So this gets integrated. Now, today we talk of multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary. But in indigenous Indian knowledge, there were no different subjects. It was all integrated as one knowledge. And therefore, in Upanishad, which are one of the oldest post-Vedic era literature, where there are a lot of stories. Storytelling in indigenous culture have been a very powerful tool of teaching and learning. And there are a variety of stories of gurukulams or places of learning where the gurus or the masters and the different students, how they learned. What is the quality or what allows you to become a guru? What allows you to become a master? So today our education is extremely superficial and we learn certain tools and techniques. We study the history of education, we pass the exam, and we become an educator. But in olden days, you actually had to be spiritually an evolved soul to be able to impart education. Today we talk of Google and cloud and storing of knowledge up there. But in olden times, the rishis, the sages, the masters really believed that all knowledge we need is up there. And we can become powerful medium to download that knowledge for learners. As Smriti ji gave this example, and they have beautifully adopted something from the Upanishad, where the learners actually take care of the cows. I've met the learners and they love what they are doing, so they actually are looking forward to taking the cow out for grazing. And in Upanishad stories, we find that one of the students by one of the masters, and this is where the customization of or individualization of education came in indigenous schools. So one of the students was given one cow and asked to come back when they become 1,000. Now imagine how much the student would have learned and self-learning, right? In order to make that one cow into 1,000. So this is how the indigenous education worked on content. The competency was for life and not for a job. Therefore, obviously, where did the pedagogy come from? The pedagogy came from the soul or the core of purpose of the education. The core of education was to generate curiosity in the learner. Because once the learner has curiosity, obviously the sense of wonder and the self-discovery would take place. A lot of reflection and sense-making was. Swadhyaya has two words, swa and adhyaya. Swa means self, and adhyaya is studying. It's a Sanskrit word, but Sanskrit, most of the words have more than one meaning. So adhyaya means learning on my own, self-learning, where I take books or I talk to my peers or I learn from somebody else. But it also means learning of self. I observe myself. I observe nature. I realize how the fire within me and how the sun in the outside cosmos are connected. And then you realize that, oh, as the sun goes up, I start feeling hungry because the fire within me is now, becoming more active. Or when the sun sets and it gets dark. I mean, today, unfortunately, because we are not teaching this at school level, college level, there is a lot of physical, mental, and spiritual health crisis, which we see in the younger generation. But the moment you realize that now it is evening, and what happens, and this is where, as Smriti rightly said, the language the rishis used was very poetical. So they said that our heart is like a lotus. Now, if you look at nature, if you look at lotus, the lotus flower blooms when the sun shines or rises, and it closes at petal when it is a sunset time or the evening time. So when the evening starts, it's time for the heart, our own heart, to calm down, stop the outer activity. Unfortunately, today, younger generation goes to gym and goes for exercising after evening hours. So one, you don't have any sense making of how you and the cosmos are connected. This was all a part of indigenous education. Today, they have been given pills, right? So you are unhappy, take a serotonin. You can't sleep, take a melatonin, right? I mean, I was shocked when I saw the well-being stores in Australia and even New Zealand selling these tablets. And I said, oh my God, but this should be naturally happening in our system. And this kind of way of life, which was very strict self-discipline, not an imposed, but a strict self-discipline, which was a part of pedagogy in Indian indigenous education. Today we say we learn from Finland, and I'm very happy that Finland is actually reviving a lot of indigenous education, in their mainstream. But aligning head, heart, and hands have always been a part of indigenous education in India. I really feel sad when our own Indian, the newly entered educators from corporate world say, oh, we have a MOU with a Japanese university. And when we went to Japan, the Japanese students were cleaning up the campus themselves. And I said, oh my God, they have no idea of their own country, India, where this was a way of living for most of the students when they were in their ashrama or gurukula, right? So hands and heart and head, where, managing the ashram, managing this learning space, keeping it clean, cooking, looking after the cows, getting water, right? Firing the fire lighting for cooking, or the rituals, everything was a part of students' life. And the way Smriti is called Matoshi, I love it. Matoshi means a mother. So anyone who rents such a learning space was a mother figure. And obviously it gets connected with Mother Earth, right? So a child who has come to a Gurukulam does not feel the lack of family life or community life. They grow up collectively as a child of a community. And this is exactly what I've been reading in Maori education, right? That one of the major disconnect between the mainstream education and Maori education, that community feeling, the family feeling, inclusiveness is a gap. They feel very alienated. And this, I think, is a gift of industrial revolution to us, that we were uprooted from nature, we were uprooted from family and community, and we are like being transplanted somewhere else. Education was also experiential and intuitive. The modern education as we see today, unfortunately, is very rational and linear and very fragmented. Like I do a lot of teachers training program, and many times I ask the teachers that when you were growing up or as a part of your education training, do you teach geography and music together? And they all say, no, how are they connected? How are they interrelated? And once I help them to just go within and, reflect on it, they say, oh, yes, why didn't we think of it? We can teach various music from different countries or different states of India itself, because India is a vast country, and also teach geography, right? So when you are teaching about a certain country or a certain state in India, if we teach the music of that part of the world or India, we can combine it, we can make it as one. And that cultivates the intuitive learning in a student. Also, I've not been able to study a lot of the Rigvedic literature, but being a researcher in Ayurveda, Atharva Veda has been my favorite. Atharva Veda is one of the 4 Vedas, one of the last to evolve, as the history says it. But there are suktas, which are the coded poetry. And in one Atharva Veda, it very clearly says that how should we study? And this is what a student is telling the teacher, that teach me in a joyful way. And the teacher very well says that, yes, I will certainly teach you in a joyful way. However, let's learn in a question and answer way, so that you ask me questions and I will answer you. Now, isn't this beautiful? Because this means that we are encouraging the curiosity and self-discovery and reflection in a student who has to come very prepared. And it's okay to have a lot of questions and don't have answers, but it's only when a student is ready to learn. So it really becomes learner-centered, and I feel very sad that in India itself, the universities talk of American university-centered learning methodologies, right? But when we look at Atharva Veda, or when we look at our own Vedic literature, Upanishadic literature, we have lots of education pedagogy that can be contextualized in today's time. Today, if you go to see what is the reality of India, we had a recent few years ago, a conference at Ujjain, which is the central part of India. More than 4,500 Gurukulams participated. However, a research also says that there are more than 10,000 Gurukulams. Anaadi is just started its journey, but there are many more like Anaadi who have been existing and participating in their own way. However, India, again, is not a geographical boundary, right? When I say India, its older name was Bharata, and it was called Bharatavarsha, which had much larger geographical boundaries, not because we invaded those countries, only because the culture was spread in those countries. So Nepal, Burma, Sri Lanka, many of them have a lot of Gurukulams which still exist. However, unfortunately, as Maori education is not integrated in mainstream, it's very sad that we are looking at mainstream being integrated into Maori, right? We should work on the reverse way, I hope. And this is for India, at least we have a ray of hope in NEP New Education Policy 2020, which was launched. I'm happy to have been a part of some of the brainstorming meetings that happened prior to the writing of the policy. And this is where I would like to share one personal example. I grew up in Mumbai, Bombay, a very westernized city in India, right? It's more closer to American way of living and thinking rather than Indian way of living and thinking. But at that time, I was very lucky to have studied in a school, one of the 10 schools recognized by UNESCO to be a good school in India. It is called the New Era School. And fortunately, Dr. Malaisa, the daughter of our founder's daughter, lives in New Zealand at the moment. And she's also in the field of education. So our school had a very unique model, which is very suitable, I think, for any indigenous culture. Our entire primary education was in our mother tongue. So we had no stress to learn English as a second language. To study, it was there as one language post our age of 6 or 7 years of age. But till then, we studied everything joyfully in our own mother tongue. Post that, English as a language was introduced, but all the subjects, everything we studied in mother tongue. Post 7th standard, which is about 13 years of age, one subject started turning into medium of instruction as English. So maybe you start to learn maths in English, maybe you start to learn history in English next year geography in English. So by the time we completed our school education, all the subjects we learned in English. So the integration at a college level, along with the mainstream education, wasn't a difficult journey for us. And this is something which somewhere in the NEP 2020 is integrated as one of the options for educational institutions. So a lot of choice and freedom and self-responsibility is given to students, teachers and educators, and also the educational institutions in this new policy. Importance of language and culture is being revived in this policy. decolonized worldview. And this is, I think, is very crucial to all the indigenous education, right? Because ultimately the lens with which we see the world and lens with which we see ourselves, I mean, the moment any indigenous tribe or culture is called backward or deficit or is not fitting the main frame, then we are doing great injustice to that culture. And so our frame of reference has to change. Only then we'll be able to work for the well-being and happiness of the entire humanity. Because the moment we change our lens, we are able to see ourselves as a great contributor coming from a culture and civilization, which is far more older, far more authentic than the industrial era driven education. And this was, I was reading a book by Dr. Sahana Singh on reimagining education in India. And in the last chapter, she talks of common threads between various indigenous education, not just Indian. This is written by Dr. Gregory, a Native American educator. And it's so beautiful that I said, let me share this, because it's so common with the Maori education and the Indian education as well. So the common thread is nature, right? Nature connected learning. Ourselves as a source of knowledge, right? And nature as source of knowledge. Also, learning requires letting go, growing. It requires a lot of collaboration. It requires a sustainable way of life, which is what is called dharma in India. It unfolds within an authentic context of community and nature. And it honors the fact that the true learning builds confidence. So it does not instill in any learner a deficit feeling or inferiority feeling that you are coming from a minority, you are coming from, what they call vernacular language in India. And I feel sad when even Indians use, instead of a regional language, the word vernacular. The word vernac means a slave in Latin. And the word vernacular means the language of slaves. So it's a very colonized word that we use for our own languages. And this is where I feel that if we are able to see the common threads, the Center for Indigenous Education that Anaadi has started will be able to build a very authentic thread across culture to create what India calls Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one country, one family, one world. And with that, my gratitude to all indigenous cultures and all the wisdom holders, because they have done a great tapas, right? Their entire journey has been of a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of struggle, and I honor that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maji, for such an optimistic presentation of how to integrate different worldviews and how important it is to stay authentic to one's own indigenous system. So as we see, education has a lot to play with the formation of an identity. Along those lines, I would like to sort of ask what are all the thoughts of Dr. Melissa with respect to decolonization, especially along the lines of pedagogy, ideological frameworks, the frameworks that you use to even assess children's developmental milestones. Because when you come from an indigenous culture, you definitely have got a different exposure to knowledge systems. It needn't be along the lines of knowing a certain language, but it would still be, like Malaji pointed out, a very relevant life skill that you would have learned. So how important is it to address aspects of decolonization, especially in the education space?
Thank you. Wow. Decolonize in New Zealand, there is some scholars, I guess, who talk of decolonization and some who speak around indigenization. In a way, they may be opposite sides of the same coin, or perhaps the same coin. I'm not sure, the same side of the same coin. Currently in New Zealand, we have a Māori education schools, so early childhood right through to tertiary, where you can learn in the Māori language, you can learn very much from a Māori worldview, you can learn about a lot of Indigenous knowledge, a lot of traditional knowledge, but also you can do, for example, a commerce degree. So they have always been held up, I guess, as the pinnacle of decolonized spaces. As an observation, and it's not a criticism, they are very much based on, the idea of a university, really, and a lot of the idea of school, and the kind of, you go to school 9 to 5 or 9 to 3, sorry, just like in any other mainstream school. 96% of Māori children in New Zealand still attend mainstream educational institutions. So the extent to which that's where our focus needs to be primarily. As you probably gathered from my talk, I'm not in favor of assessment that doesn't recognize success in a way that sees what the learner brings with them to the classroom. So traditionally, that has focused very much on certain skills, reading, writing, and maths, really. And certainly a lot of Māori children bring other skills and other cultural viewpoints that in New Zealand we are making a real effort, mostly, to at least be cognizant of, right, and to include as best as we can. But what I can worry about is I don't really like an either-or approach. I worry that could actually disadvantage Māori children, because there is a lot of scholars in New Zealand working in Māori spaces that feel anything that is from, British or the West or whatever is necessarily bad for Māori. And I don't think that is reflective of our early interactions with the British, in terms of a lot of what our ancestors did was say, wow, that works really well, let me adopt some of that. Certainly that wasn't the case for everything at all. So I want to make that really clear. But the period in New Zealand history was more nuanced than what we perhaps, what we often speak of. It's not just a binary good or bad or anything. Right. So for me, I think I like the idea of building bridges, and I like the idea of certainly what you said, Dr. Mala, around decolonization in terms of a reference point or a framework through which we see ourselves. Absolutely, I think that we need to have space for children to bring their culture, bring their success, bring their contributions to the learning environment. Do I think that should be in place of or instead of skills in, for example, my area that I work in with literacy? No, but I do think that there's a way to connect with children through culture and assessing things, if you like, that speaks to culture, rather than we are going to put this framework on you because that's what works for every other child in this classroom, but it may be different for Māori children. I hope that makes some sense. It's certainly an interesting area, and it's more complex than simply taking a kind of wholly Indigenous approach in New Zealand or wholly Māori approach, because we're so integrated in many respects. So I find for us what's working well is, or what I think will work better than perhaps other approaches, is saying that Māori can, embrace a range of things without compromising their identity as Māori.
Identity. Fantastic. Okay. That's something I think we also resonate very well with. We have a raised hand. I'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Yes.
My question is rooted in what you've shared about the two different cultures of study over there and what you're trying to integrate. So what do these people who have studied in the Maori culture later on when they're in adulthood, that's another purview that I'm putting on top of it. But what do they do? How do they live their lives? What is the parallel to the 9 to 5 over there?
What is the what? Sorry, the last part of your
What is
question.
the parallel to the 9 to 5 over there?
The 9 to 5?
What is the parallel of it?
Sorry,
What do they do
What
after
is the
school?
parallel?
the pathway afterwards. So I think to give a little bit of context about New Zealand, everybody in New Zealand speaks English, including Maori. So I don't know anybody who only speaks Maori, for example. So in a lot of the schools that we have, a lot of the tertiary institutions that I mentioned, people will still be exposed to English. And as I mentioned, a lot of the degrees, while you can do degrees that focus on Indigenous knowledge, you can do, for example, a commerce degree, and that's still the same structure as a degree at the university I'm at, for example. So the extent to which they have decolonized, it's a spectrum, right? I see it as a spectrum. Will we ever achieve pure decolonization? Maybe in some spaces. I think I like what Dr. Marla said about the frame of reference and the way we see ourselves. In other ways, possibly not. But afterwards, there is an increasing focus from our government on incorporating Māori worldview, Māori language, Māori knowledge into practices, policies, and that's what, in a way, the framework I presented helps to bring about, because it shows a way forward to, weave the different strands together. So are they disadvantaged, if you like, from going to an alternative education system? No, I don't think so. However, it's case by case, right? Some people will emerge from those institutions and flourish because there's so many factors that influence our outcomes, and others perhaps not, and vice versa. Many Māori, most Māori, as I mentioned, attend mainstream institutions, and the vast majority do very well. And the government doesn't really talk about that narrative as much as they talk about the failure, which is something I'm always pushing back against, because it's not a nice, if my son, who's Māori, obviously hears this all the time, it's not good for your psyche, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully that answered your question.
Anyways, you don't require what we study in school in real life.
You don't require it in real life?
Yeah.
Maybe. Depends what it is.
Right. Do we have any more questions from the audience? We can maybe accommodate one or two.
Hi, Karthik here. I have a question. So,
Yes, Karthik.
I think it's a great topic, and I think it's very heartwarming to hear good-minded people coming forward with and sharing ideas and perspectives. For people like us who perhaps have not known, and even Anaadi, for example, right? Where we recently came across the organization. So thank you for organizing this. But is there a way for us to kind of be connected and be subscribed in a way, thanks to the digital world that we all live in, for us to have like periodic discussions and topics and learnings, not only limited to Maori, but then obviously something well, traditioned and, chronicled as this. So is there a forum that you all look at, like the enablers that we have on the call here? What are the sources that you all, tap into to keep yourself up to date, or to keep yourself, getting inspired from a learning standpoint?
Probably I'll just mention. In fact, we created the Center for Indigenous Knowledge Systems precisely for this reason, to probably connect the educational ecosystems belonging to various native cultures and indigenous traditions. So we have your email IDs, I believe, you would have registered. And then probably we'll also create a forum, because when we went to the California, Berkeley, people there were also interested in setting up a center where many of these knowledge systems can come together. We can evolve frameworks, have discussions, host. I'm sure there are hundreds of conferences happening, but nevertheless, another conferences wouldn't hurt, because so many minds are waiting to get introduced to some of these systems. So with respect to probably Maori, we definitely take Dr. Melissa's insights and inputs and keep sort of in touch with her, and hopefully she'll reciprocate with the same. And there are more people that we got in touch for this event. They were all very, very interested, but of course the date and time and things didn't suit. So probably we'll bring more speakers from New Zealand and the Pacifico region as such. And then we are also having planning one more event with respect to South America, especially to do with the Peru and the Incas, which is upcoming probably in mid-July. And also we'll look at a few more cultures, maybe in North America as well. So that way this can become an integrated platform. And this we consider it to be whatever a bit seva, to these traditions that have, as Malaji said, have gone through tremendous amount of effort and pain to keep it sustained. So that way this can become a forum. And thank you for attending this event, Kartik ji.
Thank you. Appreciate your efforts, and I wish the team the best of luck.
Yeah, thank you. So we have more questions.
Yes, Vidyaji.
Yeah. Namaste, Dr. Melissa ji and Mala ji and Smriti ji. I was really thankful to attend this session because this kind of helped me understand how not only in India the indigenous system is getting revived, but also in other parts of the world, right? Like in New Zealand, and how they are all kind of interconnected in terms of they are evolving. Like I'm surprised to see how they also do with nature related activity, and transdisciplinary is the base, right, in Maori education also. So thanks a lot for beautifully Malaji told, you are all the bearer, torch bearers of this knowledge. So about to you. And my question is related to how this kind of the children who are participated in this Maori education or indigenous education are actually progressing in their college years. Like how do they develop further, and what kind of avenues are there? Are the infrastructure being developed for them to pursue this education in the college? And also maybe not the careers could be entirely different, but how the entire ecosystem can be seen starting from education in the primary and other years, like how it could be seen over a period of life, right? That's what we are talking about, over the life education. If you have any ideas or thoughts, maybe that would really help us enlighten to see the entire picture, like how the children are flourishing through this indigenous education system. Thank you.
Thank you. So, the schools were set up in the early 1980s. They were early childhood centres that were set up in response to the decline in the Māori language. So they were really a language revitalisation initiative in the first instance. Then when they emerged from these early childhood centres, they had nowhere to go, right? So they then set up primary schools, and then so on into secondary schools, and now into tertiary institutions, some of which are tribally based, and another one which is nationally based but has different campuses around the country. And the children who go to these schools, they certainly speak English in the same way. So I guess some may view that there would be a disadvantage to maybe going to school in these settings because of the influence of the Māori language, but there really isn't. The response that the challenge, I guess, that they have is challenges that a lot of schools face related to things like funding, related to sites for the children to attend, related certainly to teachers who have the language skills and of course the content knowledge to teach within these contexts. That's a huge one. So that comes back to universities in terms of initial teacher education and how that can happen, how that can be supported. The flourishing, I guess, I mean, gosh, that's a big question that is case by case. And also, I guess, depends on what your definition of flourishing might be. So I'm not sure I can really answer that, except to say that one thing that I always want to do is take a strengths-based approach in the framing and the stories that we tell about ourselves. What stories do we tell about ourselves? What stories do we allow to be told about us? And how does that inspire us or not? And one of the things that I'm very much interested in is some of the narratives about Māori, and particularly in the context of education, that aren't that inspiring at all, and actually, in my view, could be quite damaging. That is things like the idea that most Māori fail at school, or because Māori are always overrepresented in groups that don't particularly well, therefore people associate that all Māori must be bad at school, and that's simply not true. We need more spotlight on Māori success, in my view. Hopefully that responded to your question as well. These are big questions, and I'm trying to answer them as best I can, but please feel free to contact me.
Big word. Thank you.
Feel free to contact me or email me afterwards if I can follow up or clarify anything. It's no problem.
Yeah. Yes. So we're already running out of time. I think we could just accommodate one more question. I think we have Vinita ji with us, who's an educator herself, and she's grown up in, New Zealand. She's an Indian, and she was grown up in New Zealand. Vinita ji, would you like to ask something?
Namaste, namaste. Thank you, Malaji and Smriti, and Kira, Dr. Derby. Very good to hear someone from New Zealand after a long time. So I spent about 10 years in New Zealand, from about 96 to 2006. So I grew up there, and West Auckland is where I was. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I am just beginning to realize the commonalities of the Indigenous, not just in terms of education, but the intergenerational relationships, how we view nature, even menstrual practices, I was just seeing how they're so common amongst the Indigenous cultures. So thank you so much. And I am so excited about delving more and learning more about this. I just want to put 2 points out there, and I don't know if we'll have time to discuss this, but when you were talking about the Maori children and, how deficit in being Maori itself, that's how it's being viewed. And the school that I am leading right now, it's in a rural town in southern India. And when we recruit teachers, and most of them come from city areas, and they come in with this mindset that these rural kids, there is a deficit, fundamentally they are set out for failure. And it's a challenge for me. I mean, when they come in and after a few months, when they start interacting with these kids and these kids show them how they're beautifully different and, they have their own unique perspectives, then they kind of warm up. But when they first initially come in with a lot of these teachers, there's a sense of, I don't need to give as much. And they set their bars very low for these students, and it's very disheartening. And that's a challenge, and I'm constantly working on it. So any perspective on that from your side would be lovely. And the other thing that I am struggling with is the language aspect. So there in New Zealand, like Maori kids, as you said, they all are exposed to English. They speak in English and from when they're little. But here, when they come into school, English is the main language here in all of the schools, most of the schools. The Central Board of Secondary Education with the CBSE schools that we're working with, until they come into kindergarten, they are not exposed to English at all. They don't have, they've not heard it. They've not, been exposed to it at all. And then they come in and we're starting off with English rhymes and English stories and all of these things. And now with NEP 2020 that Malaji had talked about, they said, for primary, let's keep English as the, language mode of instruction. So they're familiar with the content, let them learn the content in their comfort zone. But there's this other thought that says, it's good to introduce another language before they're about 8 years. After that, learning another language becomes a little tricky. So that's another challenge, when they have to go through higher education, tertiary education in English. Do we expose them to, instruction early on in English or in their mother tongue? I mean, that's another challenge that we have been discussing lately with our teachers. But these 2 points just stood out for me from the presentation. But thank you so much. I'll definitely be in touch with you and Malaji. But beautiful presentation. Thank you both so very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Sorry, very quickly. Lovely to hear your slight New Zealand accent there, and I completely agree with you. Some of the deficit narratives and the influence, we know the influence teacher expectations can have on children's learning. And for me, that would be a conversation that I would perhaps start with some of your teachers around the deficit framing and stories about children in rural settings. We hear the same in New Zealand here, and I'm looking to do some research on that with teachers, just to not to judge teachers or to point fingers or anything, but just to get a sense of the impact of some of these stories about Māori learners, where there's very little consideration of difference. Māori have never been a monolithic group any more than any other cultural group around the world, but we are very much portrayed in that way by the ministry and other organisations. So I'm more than happy to continue these conversations afterwards on email. So if anybody needs anything clarified, please feel free to reach out. I'd appreciate it. And thank you for the opportunity to converse with you all.
Yeah. Thank you, one and all. It has been such a very interesting, very engaging and interactive session. We hope to continue more of this in different editions. I still have too many hands raising, but since we are really running out of time, I request you to mail your questions to us so that we can reach out to Melissa ji and we can get back to you with answers. So that said, we look forward to continued associations, and we really look forward to keep passing the baton as well, so that we form some level of a synthetic approach, that synthesis approach that sort of helps blend the old and the new, or the right and the wrong, or however you want to call it. But the most important thing is to have a holistic development towards education. And I think all of this is such an invigorating session towards that. So thank you. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you to the speakers. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to the participants.
I will end it with a very small invocation. Om Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om. Thank you.